Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Brian Taylor, educator with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association, and thanks for joining us today for River Stories. Every river has a story to tell, and today we're going to be focusing on some restoration work, or soon to be restoration work, on a particular stream behind me. So today, to help us understand what's going on, I am joined by Samantha Woods, Executive Director of the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. Welcome, Samantha.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
So, Samantha, can you tell us a little bit about where we are and what we're seeing here?
The river that we're looking at right here is known as the Indian Head River, and this is a tributary to the North River. The Indian Head River is actually the town boundary between Pembroke over there and Hanover on this side, and then upstream it also flows through the town of Hanson. So many times these rivers were known, were easy boundaries for the colonists when they first came to divide up the communities. This river is a really special resource. It's a major tributary to the North River. It's about 5 miles long, and it has several tributaries, the Indian Head Brook and Rocky Run, and then Drinkwater River comes in. It's a much more extensive watershed. It goes all the way up into the watershed for this river, goes all the way up to the Weymouth Naval Air Station. So it's a bit bigger than many of the tributaries on our watershed to the North River, as you can see from sort of the volume of the flow here. And this is sort of the head of the tide. We're about 12 miles from the ocean. And just downstream, we're still feeling the influences of the tidal forcing 12 miles away from the ocean. And so very unique system where the water downstream is freshwater, but going up and down with the tide.
Wow. So, Samantha, what are some of the main concerns about this river system here?
Some of the main concerns that we have for the health of the Indian Head River include the contamination, historic contamination that went on up at the fireworks site. This was a heavily industrialized river. In fact, we're standing right here at a dam that was a former rubber factory, and there are multiple dams on the river, 2 along the Indian Head, this one here at the Ludham's Ford Park, also known as the Elm Street Dam. And then upstream, we have another dam called, it's really just some rock rubble left over from that colonial era, called the State Street Cross Street Dam. It's just downstream of that bridge. And then the Factory Pond Dam, where the fireworks site contamination stems from. So that contamination really left behind sort of a legacy of pollution upstream with mercury in the water, not in the water so much as in the sediments behind the Factory Pond Dam. And mercury, if you're not familiar with it, contaminates ecosystems by being bioaccumulated up the food chain. So things that live in the sediments, macroinvertebrates, are taking in some of that sediment with the mercury, and then a frog or a fish might eat that macroinvertebrate, and then a bird, and it accumulates more and more as they go up the food chain, and mercury, as you know, can be toxic. So that's a major concern for this watershed, as is the dams and what the impacts might be on this river system.
All right, so Samantha, what are some forms of restoration work that has been done here on the Indian Head River?
So Brian, some restoration projects have occurred here, but there's so much more that could be done. You can see right here there's a fish ladder. So there has been an attempt for what I consider to be partial restoration. There are herring, river herring, and shad that spawn in this river system, which is really unique. Shad, there's only maybe a handful of river systems left in Massachusetts and throughout the eastern seaboard that still support populations of shad, and we're very fortunate that we have one here in the North River system in the Indian Head. Shad are just a much larger, they're called the king herring. They're a larger fish than the river herring, but they're in the same family. They, like river herring, migrate from the freshwater from the ocean up into the freshwater. And so this fish ladder is an attempt at sort of partial restoration for those migrating fish to get over this dam. We're not really clear how successful that's been. As you can see, the ladder itself is sort of in the middle of the fish ladder, so we can't monitor it as well. We can't get out to it safely. So while I'm sure it passes some fish, It's probably not that efficient or effective at passing a large number because we see them sort of stacked up beneath the dam here. We did do a culvert removal project to increase brook trout habitat. So we have eastern native brook trout in the system. They're a native species that whose populations have diminished, like the river herring. And they live in the tributaries. They need that cold, flowing water. And there was a culvert that was in their way acting as a dam that wasn't needed anymore on the Iron Mine Brook. And so that culvert has been removed in that part of the river, now opened up just for brook trout and other species that can use the river. So there's a lot more that could be done.
Wow, so what are some potential restoration projects that could happen in the future?
So that's a really good question, Brian. There is a lot of potential in the Indian Head for river restoration. And it's going to hinge upon quite a few things. But one of the unique aspects of this area is that up at the factory pond and fireworks site, that area is undergoing remediation as we speak to remove some of the unexploded ordnance that was left behind and during that manufacturing period. And a plan is in place for removing the mercury. So that part, I think, is underway and continues to need our advocacy and support to have it move forward. But one of the things that happen as a result of that fireworks site is funding is available for restoration off-site, away from where the actual contamination occurred, for habitat restoration, in particular for fisheries, because the mercury contamination affected fisheries quite a bit. We're not able to take fish from the river anymore because of the mercury that is in the system. Even though the mercury in the sediments is upstream, the fish came down in over the dams and are around here, so we can't use those. But the good news is that there's a good amount of funding available to review what we can do to restore the river habitat for those fisheries. And so there's been some initial work to look at the dams here and at State Street, this Ludham's Ford Dam and State Street Dam, and to examine what the feasibility of removal might be. And we're just in the process of getting that data so that we can bring it to the public and talk to the public about what they'd like to see done here, and what the pros and cons might be for removing the dams on the Indian Head River and restoring that historic run.
Wow, so what are some of the main challenges or concerns about some of these restoration projects?
So, well, I think that some of the concern is just going to be the public's feeling about it. And so part of our job is to really educate the public about the pros and cons of making these decisions to remove and restore the river habitat. And of course, the sediment quality is going to have to be defined. It may be that there's some contaminated sediments behind these dams. To my mind, that's even more reason that we would want to, take care of it and remove it. We don't want to see the dam fail and then have that sediment go downstream. So we want to make sure that we don't create a hazardous waste site permanently with the dam. So either way, we want to see the sediment removed if there's any contamination. But definitely, I think the biggest challenge is just going to be having the public discourse and educating people about it.
So what are some of the impacts that these dams have on the rivers around here?
So that's a great question too. Dams have been here for several hundred years and were put in place to really power the industry that grew up in the area before we had electricity, right? But now they're kind of left behind. And what they do to the river habitat is really fragment the river's habitat for species that need free-flowing water, cool water. They need that flowing river habitat. We call it lotic habitat. Free-flowing river habitat is one of the most endangered habitats on the planet, never mind in our own state. And so that free-flowing river has real benefits. And when we put the dams in, it prevents those things from happening, from the flow of water. It a dam will hold back water, and then when it holds back the water, it slows it down. By slowing it down, the sediments drop out, and so you start to see those sediments accumulate behind the dam. We also see increased temperatures from the solar gain from spreading that water out and slowing it down. So we can have temperatures in the 80s in the water column here. Obviously, cold water fish don't like that. It also diminishes the oxygen behind the dam, so oxygen levels decrease. And it prevents the free flow of that sediment. While clearly we wouldn't want sediment to be contaminated going downstream, we do want uncontaminated sediment to migrate naturally along the river corridor. It helps to sustain our marshes downstream, and this is really part of the natural system of the river. So by putting a dam in place, we're sort of preventing that. And then in the summertime, we see no flow sometimes beneath the dam because we don't have a stream flow release plan. When the water levels go down beneath the spillway and there's just no water going over the dam, this area can be dewatered. And obviously if you're a river fish, that's a problem. So those are just some of the impacts that dams can have on our rivers.
So Samantha, what are some of the considerations one must take when planning large-scale restoration projects like this?
So that's a great question. I think a lot of people probably don't understand what it means to own a dam, and that the owners are responsible for any damage as a result of failure of that dam. And these are aging pieces of infrastructure in the water, and they were built many, many years ago, and they weren't built to today's standards for flood control. So in many cases, they're vulnerable to changing precipitation patterns, to increased precipitation that we're seeing under climate change scenarios. So they really can be a liability for the owners of the dam because they're responsible if anything happens, any damage that could come from it. So that's something that I think people need to consider, if they when they're thinking about whether I should remove a dam or not. And keeping a dam really requires a heck of a lot of maintenance and potentially significant changes engineering-wise and long-term maintenance. So that's something that I think needs to be considered when thinking about dam removal versus keeping a dam. And then I think sediments, the funding, the public sentiment, all of those things need to be part of your consideration when we're talking about the dam removal.
Okay, so what are some of the positive outcomes that could happen from restoration projects like this?
Some of the positive outcomes that can come from the restoration of the river through dam removal is, of course, the restoration of the ecological function of that river. In this particular case, we would see shad and herring being able to spawn further upstream, but we'd also see other species that are river-loving being able to populate the river again. So definitely ecological benefits would come from sort of reconnecting the river to its natural habitat. And then from the owner's point of view, from the management of the system, it becomes self-sustaining and we don't have to spend money again on it. It doesn't require long-term maintenance and care. It doesn't require somebody coming out every day and making sure that the fish ladder works or worrying about whether or not the thing is going to fail in a flood because we've removed that and any long-term costs associated with that. So there can be multiple positive outcomes from both an ecological perspective and from a sort of financial perspective.
So really importantly, what are some things that the folks of Rockland, Hanover, Hanson, and Pembroke do to protect and preserve their waterways within their towns and communities?
The first thing that people can do is what they're doing right now, learning more about the system and the habitat that existed here before and could be restored again, and becoming more knowledgeable about that possibility and being part of the conversation when the decision to do this is put before the community, because these are community resources, and the community will be the deciding factor as to what gets done here. So in terms of restoring this river system, I think really education is key. And the students that are watching these stories, I hope, will go home and share this information with their own families and talk amongst themselves about what they'd like to see done here.
Wow, thanks so much, Samantha. That was really interesting and a definite call to action for the students of these towns around this river and this incredibly valuable resource. There's something that everyone can do to help. And it doesn't have to be a big action. It can be lots of little things that lead up to big positive change within their communities. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Brian Taylor, educator with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association, and we will see you out on the river.